You're listening to The White Rabbit, conversations on the art of presenting in a rather noisy world. Your hosts are Matt Krause and Alper Rosales. Matt helps leaders of international companies speak, write, and present with confidence. Alper is a communications trainer and a startup investor with a diverse portfolio of companies in Barcelona. If you like this podcast, please share it with friends and colleagues. Now, on to Matt and Alper for today's conversation.
Alper, in a recent episode, we were talking about Oren Klaff versus win without pitching and prizing with a Z, by the way, not a C. Prizing and what would Oren Klaff say about it and what would Blair Enns say about it and win without pitching. And then you were presenting a third way. And when I went into it with this binary mindset, the 1 and 0 mindset, Oren Klaff or win without pitching, or maybe they're both the same, or there were just two options there. You got really worked up. So tell me more about that. What was on your mind?
I remember that, yeah. Well, I think if I remember correctly, it was about why am I confined? Why do I have to think of it in binary terms? And I see a lot of this everywhere, by the way. I mean, I think you and I talked about this extensively, not on the podcast, but outside the podcast.
Sure.
You go on LinkedIn, there are posts about do this, don't do that. And those are the only options.
Yeah.
If you want to succeed in X, you need to do A, B, C.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're not even open for discussion.
True.
I believe, at least from my own experience, both as a speaker and a listener in presentations, I believe that the real world doesn't work like that.
Okay.
I believe that communicating with people, especially if you're making a presentation, especially a business presentation, I think there are so many moving parts that are active during that communication.
Okay.
That you cannot and you should not. Well, maybe I'm creating a 1 and 0 situation myself here. I don't think you should walk into any room thinking that, okay, if this, then that. I'm going to do this and this and this, and I'm going to do A, B, C, and the result will be X, Y, Z. I think it's a very dangerous way to approach presentations or any communication for that matter, because at any point there could be so many moving parts. So I think that's why I was worked up on that. Should I do this or that question, or should I approach it this way or that way? Because we don't know all of those moving parts before. We cannot predict all of those moving parts beforehand, and it would be dangerous to assume that we would be able to do to control the situation 100%.
So let me see if I understand you correctly. In what you're suggesting, if I am the presenter, for example, what you're suggesting is that when I walk in the room, there's a certain amount of unknowns. I don't know, okay, do step 1, do step 2, then do step 3, do step 4. It's just like, okay, there's a bunch of people in the room and there's a PowerPoint deck somewhere, and I'm hoping that I can read the room well enough. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. At the same time, you and I talked extensively on this podcast about the necessity for adequate and not adequate, actually, for good preparation beforehand. And those attempts in being well prepared is actually to alleviate any issues that may arise from last minute moving parts.
Okay.
So I'm not saying that you cannot be prepared enough. I think you can be really prepared, but still with all the preparation, there probably would be things beyond your control. And if you walk into that room thinking, okay, lo and behold, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to do this, and then that's going to be the outcome. I think you're opening yourself up for failure. And by the way, last week, I think we need to mention. I have to mention this since this is a podcast about presentations and communications.
Sure.
Have you seen the documentary on Netflix called "The American Factory"?
I have seen it, but it's been a long time. I don't remember it very well.
Okay, I didn't know it had been a long time. I thought it was new, but in that documentary, I think there is very good examples of exactly what not to do during corporate communications, especially internal communications. Because
what are some of those?
In those situations, I believe most of those people making those presentations or speeches walked into the room thinking that this is what I'm going to say, this is the result that's going to happen. It did not work that way, and you could see it in people's faces. I have never seen a group of people so disconnected from the speaker, and the speaker insistently running the communication through the wall.
Uh-huh.
And of course, the end result was painful to say the least.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
in that regard, I think, as I mentioned, those people walked into those presentations thinking that this is my topic, this is what I'm going to do, and this is going to be the result. It did not work that way. So, coming back to communications in general,
Uh-huh.
if I walk into any room thinking that these are my options and I'm going to pick one of them, I think we will be limiting ourselves and we might end up shooting ourselves in the foot.
Okay. So let me give you an example. So I am making a presentation and I recognize that there are a lot of unknowns. However, I've done excellent preparation. I've binge listened to all of Matt and Alper's most excellent podcast episodes, every single one of them. And,
Okay.
and I am
I
the
wonder
best
which ones they
prepared
will be.
person. Yeah. I am now the best prepared person in the world. And I've done all of the things that Matt and Alper have recommended over the past couple of years. So I am
Hmm.
very well prepared, but there's still some unknowns. I'm still walking into that room a little bit nervous, a little bit unsure, and questioning my ability to read the
Hmm.
room and wondering if it's going to be good enough. So, what are some of the things that I can do
Hmm.
during the presentation, and like, if I sense that the presentation is going off the rails and it's going in the wrong direction, it's not connecting, what are some of the things that I can do?
It's a good question. I think one of the things not to do, and I'm also guilty of this in the past,
Hmm.
would
Okay.
be to ignore the signs. I mean, I
Okay.
remember myself years and years ago feeling those signs, receiving those signs, even in the form of visual cues, and
Hmm.
ignoring them and keeping up with the presentation. And of course, I was doing nothing but driving the train faster into the wall.
Okay.
I think what it was messy, by the way.
I'll
I
bet. I'll
think
bet.
what we can do is be on the lookout for immediate and subtle signs that we might be losing the audience. And if we feel confident enough in those signs, acknowledge it. Like maybe
Hmm.
stop, pause for a second, and acknowledge the situation. Say something like, not something like, "Hey, are you lost?" I
Hmm.
wouldn't, I wouldn't say something like that to the audience, but say
Uh,
something to the extent of, "I feel I'm failing to make a strong enough connection with you," or I feel, I think, well, I definitely would keep the subject to myself,
hmm.
to the first person, and I will say something like, I feel I might not be making the progress that we would both want to make. Is that the case?
Okay.
If that's the case,
Hmm.
is there another angle that we could approach this topic?
Okay.
And then we could talk about anything between rescheduling the meeting if it is a bad day for them,
Hmm.
to canceling the engagement in the first place,
Okay.
or actually put it on the table and address the elephant in the room.
Hmm.
That's something that was not happening in this documentary that I saw. And of course, although they didn't show the entire speeches, I could see in the faces of those people that they were lost in connection beyond recovery, and the
Hmm.
keeper and the speaker just kept talking and talking and talking, which made the whole situation much worse.
And what were some of the signs that made you're sitting there watching this documentary? What were some of the signs that made you realize that they've lost these people? Are you looking at their body language, which we're all pretty good just through natural life experience? We're all pretty good at reading body language. So is that what you were doing? You were looking at their body language? What
Well,
were you
there were a
doing
lot
that
of
that
eyes
told you?
rolling.
Uh-huh.
There were a lot of rolling eyes, yawning people,
Mm-hmm.
and you could
Mm.
literally see the frustration in their faces. But of course, again,
Okay. Yeah.
this is a documentary. For all I know, the scenes of people hearing the speech might not even be from the same speech. But from my own experience, from the signs that I chose to ignore in the past, they were
Mm-hmm.
mostly about rolling eyes and a general sense of
Mm.
disconnect from the people.
Okay.
I think those are difficult to miss.
And one thing that I noticed about the phrase or the phrases that you recommended that people use in a situation like that was that you were advising people to stick with the first person. I feel
Hmm.
this, I feel that.
Yes.
And not go into, because the human impulse is to start every sentence with you. And instead, you're suggesting that people shut down that impulse and stick with I. I feel this, I feel that. Is that correct?
Just to be clear, yes, it is
Uh-huh.
correct, but just to be clear, only at moments of attempting recovery.
Okay.
Because during the speech itself, I strongly
Uh-huh.
recommend not using the I, or us, or we, or our. I
Okay.
strongly recommend using instead the you,
Uh-huh.
and addressing the other person through their lens and through their personalities. But if there's an attempt to recover something that might be lost,
Okay.
then I would recommend to invoke the I,
Mm.
because I wouldn't want to put any responsibility on the audience for any loss of connection. It's not
Okay.
their responsibility. It's not their problem. It's not their making.
Uh-huh.
They're sitting there
Okay.
listening to me. It is my
Uh-huh.
responsibility to keep them engaged and connected. And if there's a failure in that attempt, then I take 100% responsibility for that. It is my making, and it
Mm.
is time to accept that and take
Mm.
responsibility. So that's the only that could be the only case during any speech where I would strongly recommend using the word I instead of you.
Okay. So it's about time
I mean, think
to
of it this
wrap
way.
up.
You're
Oh, go
Before we
ahead.
wrap up, think of it this way. You're listening to a presentation, you're grossly disconnected because the person is
Uh-huh.
failing to connect with you or interest you. And then he or she says something like, Matt, you seem lost.
I would want to slap that person.
How would the rest of that conversation go?
Yeah, the rest
Can
of
you
the
can you
conversation would
imagine?
not go well at all. Yeah, I would just want
Yeah,
to stand up
that's
and
why
punch that person in the face.
yeah, and since we don't condone violence on this podcast,
Yeah.
I would recommend evading any situation that might end up with you or any listener punching anyone in the face. So yeah, that's why
Okay, good
I
point.
would recommend to stick with that I instead of you when there is something to acknowledge.
Yeah, we want to stay away from inciting violence or bloody noses.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's about time for us to wrap up for today. So before we wrap up, are there any other points that you wanted to make or things that you wanted to say?
No, I'm good. I'm sure something will come up to
Okay.
be worked up on before our next episode, though.
Yeah, of course. So thank you very much, Alper, and I will talk to you next week then.
Talk to you. Bye bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to The White Rabbit with Matt Krause and Alper Rosanes. You can subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or through your favorite feed.